We adapted like everyone else. Adapted on the fly.
Oh. Catherine Scott just joined us from Bethesda, Maryland. That's exciting.
And I see Tony Lynham from Bangkok, I believe, is there.
Is that the Red Panda BKK?
Yeah.
Ah, good name. And I don't know, Rishi Narang, where are you from?
Yeah, that's my friend. He's here in Hong Kong.
From Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. All right. All right, it's 9 o'clock, so maybe we'll go ahead and start. And thanks everyone for joining. It's 9 a.m. Oops, okay, practice. It's 9 a.m. in Hong Kong, the middle of the night in Europe, and the evening in the US. Welcome to our first ever #AskSustainableAsia live stream event. We're going to give our listeners the chance to ask the experts questions following our Pangolin Report Season 7, which looked at pangolin trafficking here in Asia. There's been a lot of discussion lately about the role of pangolins and COVID-19, novel coronavirus. So that's going to be our topic and discussion today. So it should be pretty interesting. So here to talk with us about this is Tim Bonebrake, an associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences at HKU. He's a conservation biologist studying how global development is impacting biodiversity. And recent work in his lab has examined wildlife trade dynamics and the roles of China and Hong Kong in pangolin trafficking. We've also got Astrid Andersson, a conservation biologist specializing in wildlife trade, currently doing a PhD at HKU, right outside Tim's office, actually, at Biological Sciences. She's also the founder of Hong Kong for Pangolins, a local community group trying to raise awareness about pangolins and understand pangolin consumption and trade trends in the region, which is pretty significant given that Hong Kong is a major player in the illegal trafficking of pangolins. So welcome, Tim and Astrid.
Thank you.
We're super excited. I'm super excited, except that I just lost my camera, sorry. Then why don't we, if you're listening and you want to ask a question, you can just add a question into the chat, or you can tweet on Sustainable Asia, tweet hashtag #AskSustainableAsia on Twitter. Any one of those, we'll pick them up and we'll add it to the forum. But we did get a few questions already on Twitter. But before we do that, maybe we'll let Tim kick off and explain a little bit of the science behind the genetic link between pangolins and the novel coronavirus and why that's important.
Sure.
Handing it to you, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, so the reason this is important, of course, is to prevent future emerging infectious diseases, and also to make sure that there's not continued potential spillover from animal reservoirs or hosts to humans. It's important to find the origin of the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. So as soon as this came out, scientists have been looking for the origin of SARS-CoV-2, and one of the immediate suspects was bats. And so from a sample taken in Yunnan in 2013, from fecal samples from bats, they discovered a virus which is closely related to SARS-CoV-2. About 96% of the genome is related to that bat sequence. Not long after that, it was discovered that from seized pangolin samples, that pangolins are apparently hosts of also closely related viruses. Not as closely related as the bat virus from the Yunnan sample, but still quite closely related and close enough related that there are questions about whether or not pangolins have any role in the emergence of SARS-CoV-2. We don't know at this stage whether or not they have played any role. What we do know, based on these sequences from seized pangolins, we do know that pangolins appear to host coronaviruses that are related to SARS-CoV-2, and that is a cause for concern in terms of these species being the most trafficked mammal on the planet. There are questions about whether or not the continued trafficking of pangolins could lead to another emerging infectious disease.
All right, so that's the big issue on the plate right now, is what to do then, whether or not it's actually going to save the pangolins and help the pangolins, or simply because maybe they're infectious now. So we'll turn to a question from Michael Paoni via Twitter, which is kind of an Astrid question, which is that what efforts are the governments and countries involved in the illegal trade taking to stop this? Are they serious? What are the ongoing commitments? And how do we hold them accountable for this illegal pangolin trafficking?
Well, they are all committed to not trading pangolins, because most countries, almost all countries, are signatories to the Convention in International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES, which made all trade in pangolins illegal in 2016. However, these signatories have to then implement those laws in their own countries independently. So they have to honor their commitment independently. And I know that Hong Kong only put the law in place regarding pangolins last year. So it took, there's a bit of a delay. But countries are working towards fully banning all trade in all species of pangolins, because they're all signatories to CITES, so they should be doing that. However, there are some loopholes. In China, for example, there is a quota that is still legally allowed to be sold for medicinal purposes, pangolin scales specifically. So that creates kind of a confusing picture for consumers, because on the one hand, you're being told it's illegal, you shouldn't be doing it, and on the other hand, you're able to legally purchase it in a pharmacy. So it's commitment is varied across different countries, and they take their own approach. But what we have seen is across Asia, there's been a huge amount of very big seizures detected by customs. So in Singapore, in Bangkok, in Hong Kong, and across China, which could indicate a larger volume of scales and pangolins being trafficked. But it also actually has two positive impacts, which means that these scales and pangolins do not end up on the black market, which is a good thing. And secondly, probably arguably more important, the media and the international community, there's an opportunity to become more aware about pangolin smuggling and pangolin trafficking and the overexploitation of pangolins. So there has been, some customs have been doing some good work in seizing these huge shipments, and the international community is becoming more aware, which is good.
Which is the most important thing.
Yeah. But there are a few things that Hong Kong, for example, and China could do to make those impacts even more effective, which would be in Hong Kong specifically, wildlife crime. There's a number of NGOs pushing for wildlife crime to be classified under the Organized and Serious Crime Ordinance, which would mean that these customs officials, once they have seized the pangolin scales, have the power to then investigate across international borders and find the kingpins and the people who are actually involved in the international organized crime behind this. At the moment, they don't have those powers, which is severely limiting in prosecutorial terms and everything else. So that's one thing they could do. And in China, for example, they could maybe make the messaging more clear by not having the legal quota of pangolin scales allowed for medicinal purposes.
That's right. That's the key, right? And do you know when they might be discussing that in China next? Working on the wildlife conservation law? At the
moment, there's a lot of discussion in China, because they did push through a temporary ban in response to COVID on wildlife trade in late January, and then they did make that ban permanent in late February. However, they're now ironing out the details, which is very difficult actually to decide, what is wildlife, what can be farmed, what cannot be farmed, for which purposes can you use wildlife, all those sorts of things. And it's still ongoing, and we'll see what ends up being on the list, I suppose. But I think that because China has been really pushing traditional Chinese medicine, I don't think they'll include traditional Chinese medicine in the wildlife trade ban. And there are many species and taxa that are traded for both medicinal and food purposes. So it's a bit tricky. You can have snake tonic wine, for example, that is supposed to be good for your health. You have pangolins, you have other species like crocodile that are consumed both for like food and also another purpose like fashion, leather or something.
Right. And some of those are actually even farmed in China, correct? Not just traded in them. So there's a lot of complicated factors and connections and things to consider in China. Okay, well, Tim, maybe we'll switch again back to biology, hardcore biology rather than laws, and go with a question that Sean Wynne Jones gave us via Twitter, which was, how can we confirm that COVID-19 comes from nature? And how does knowing where it comes from maybe help the pangolins?
Sure. There's been a lot of question about whether or not SARS-CoV-2 came from nature or came from a lab. The considerable weight of evidence is that SARS-CoV-2 came from nature. And there are a couple ways we know that. The first one is actually looking at the genetic sequence and the structure of the viral genome, which is not really resembling of anything that's bioengineered. The second thing, and to me the more sort of important weight of evidence, is the fact that these viruses spill over into different species very naturally, and this is something that happens a lot. So we know that SARS, for example, came from wildlife. Nobody argues that or disputes that. Ebola, and you name most viruses that you've heard of originally came from wildlife, and so there's no reason really to believe that this one is any different. The way to confirm it is sampling, and so right now we don't have enough samples, both from wild populations and within wildlife trafficking routes of wildlife, to really pin down the exact pathway that this virus made it to humans. And then in terms of the second question, for pangolins, it's important because it is a public health issue. And so we need to think about what that means for public health and what that means for pangolins as well. And so this issue of One Health, the health of animals and the health of people together, suddenly this becomes a really important issue. And so there's been considerable efforts to try to conserve pangolins because they are important parts of the ecosystem and they're an important element of biodiversity. And now that we know that there is this potential public health concern, we also need to think about it in terms of One Health.
Great, thanks for that one. We just got a question in from Twitter for Astrid from Ariane DeRosier. And that question is, what would it take for China and other countries to reduce or dismantle these medicinal food quotas? Would it be more studies into the medicinal effects of pangolin scales, or maybe more studies into how they can be carriers? What do you think are some of the key ways to push these international bodies to move on this subject?
Well, I think every government, even if it isn't liberal democracy, is affected by opinion and their public image. So if we, as citizens of the globe and custodians of Earth, we can be loud enough and say that we really don't want this, I do think that that can have an impact. And I do think that we need to be really vocal about that, because last year, the WHO officially recognized traditional Chinese medicine, and there have been also with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it's something that China's really, trying to push. And of course, there's, it's not all. We shouldn't take traditional Chinese medicine as like something bad necessarily, but we can emphasize that endangered species should be excluded from use in traditional Chinese medicine. And there are maybe alternatives. I know that Hong Kong U has a traditional Chinese medicine researchers looking into alternatives to pangolin scales that are plant-based, for example. And I do think that type of research could be helpful. And I think that authorities are responsive to public opinion as well. So that those two things working in tandem could maybe have an impact.
And it's good to know, you even mentioned to me once that it's not just China that uses the pangolin scales for medicinal purposes. It's even other countries do it as well.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah.
Right?
And I mean, at the same time, China's not the only one in consuming wildlife and endangered species. There's wildlife markets like the one where COVID emerged in very many different countries across Africa, India, and as I mentioned on the podcast, in Europe, we consume wildlife all the time. So we have to also look at ourselves and on a national level, implement laws that are exemplary in terms of wildlife use and think about that as well.
Yeah. There's some great research actually going on at HKU Med. They've found things like, seahorses actually have no efficacy in Chinese medicine. And there are a lot of studies going on in China. And I guess it's a matter of bubbling that up to the government level and battling some of the wildlife farm entrenched positions as well, right? So, Tim, we did have a question from Josie Chan via Twitter, which is, if it's true that pangolins can be an intermediary host and carry the coronavirus, then how do we ensure that humans don't get the coronavirus from the pangolins?
Sure.
And is that going to be a big issue going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this interesting question about whether or not pangolins were the intermediate host for SARS-CoV-2, and we don't know at this stage whether or not it was. But as I mentioned earlier, it is quite clear that pangolins do host coronaviruses that are related to SARS-CoV-2. So this is an important issue. Okay, so the second question, which I think is really important, is how do we avoid spillover of coronaviruses from pangolins or other species to humans? And the answer to that question is leave them alone. Leave them in their natural homes, leave them in their natural environments, maintain stable natural ecosystems, and as long as we're not disrupting their habitat, disrupting their homes, or trafficking pangolins, there's very, very low risk of the kinds of zoonoses that we're concerned about.
Okay, but can you just really quickly describe the zoonoses?
Yeah, sorry. So zoonosis is a viral transmission from one species to another. So we're concerned. There is a considerable concern about zoonotic transmission from, for example, pangolins to humans potentially, and that's one of the concerns regarding these coronaviruses.
So then, Astrid, do you think, another question that we got via Twitter, do you think, given this information from Tim, and given the fact that maybe we shouldn't be handling the pangolins so much, do you think that will be a better force for reducing the trade of pangolins? Like, could the word get out that, oh, these pangolins have coronavirus and don't touch them, or?
Yeah, I don't think it hurts, right? I think it will be positive in terms of reducing pangolin consumption. But it's difficult to say what drives consumption, really. I mean, there's been a lot of research trying to figure that out, and it seems like for a large portion of people, conservation messaging alone isn't enough to deter them from consuming wildlife. So saying sharks are disappearing, for example, doesn't really make people stand up and go, oh, well, I won't have shark fin soup then, but there have been some NGOs that have looked into a different angle where they say, yeah, but shark fins contain mercury, and mercury can be bad for your health. And that's been a bit more effective. And there was this one study in Taiwan on exotic pets where they basically set it up so people, see which exotic pet is best for them. And then at the end, it would say, okay, well, this species is threatened by this, and they'd be like, oh, never mind. And then it would say, you could catch, this or that disease from this. And then people would be like, oh, well, I won't choose that. Show me another option then. And so it seems like personal safety and disease risk is a little bit more persuasive than environmental messaging alone. But I think that it can all work in combination. I mean, now people are a lot more aware of the threats that pangolins are facing and how they're being used unsustainably and disappearing. So I think that this on top of that will hopefully be helpful. But I mean, by the same token, that should deter people from bats or consuming bats. That should deter people from consuming any wildlife that's been kept in unhygienic conditions generally.
So I think just to add to that, I totally agree with that point. But one of the concerns that I have and a lot of people have is the relationship between bats and coronaviruses has not really helped bat conservation. In fact, I think a lot of people are concerned that it's resulting in people wrongly eradicating populations of bats. And so there is a concern about that happening with pangolins as well. So I think that's something we need to be cognizant of and aware of, and hopefully make sure that doesn't happen. But I do think there's an opportunity here, and hopefully with the raised profile of pangolins as sort of important parts of the ecosystem, and when we disrupt those parts of the ecosystem, we risk these kinds of diseases. Then hopefully that will lower the trade.
Yeah, hopefully. So that's, even in our reporting, we've kind of approached it normally in the West in conservation, it works really well to show the cuddly, cute animals as a way, of wanting to protect them. But I do find here in Asia, the story is more about health. So when microplastics are in seafood, you stop eating the seafood, right? And maybe if pangolins are maybe carry the coronavirus, then maybe you stop consuming them. We'll see. But Wander Meyer of GlobeScan, who's done a lot of research into the demand side of wildlife trade, he just mentioned that the big difference of wildlife markets and trade in China and the rest of the world is the scale and organization of it. So we can look at ourselves, but the demand for pangolins and most other wildlife in mainland China is driving the global demand. And I think that's the comment that Astrid made before about the large pharmaceuticals using pangolin scales, and the fact that it is actually a big business. You can pick up a pill bottle, right, that has pangolin scales as its ingredient. So any comment to that, you guys? Or
Yeah, I do think that this legal and illegal interface is a big problem. So China not including wildlife that is used for medicinal purposes in its wildlife trade ban is leaving a big loophole where farmers or, traders can be ostensibly farming or trading something for medicinal purposes, but then also on the side be selling it for meat, for wildlife trade, like food, wild meat. That you could like pythons, for example, can be used for both leather and and food, and leather is still allowed, fashion is still allowed. Raccoon dogs are used for their fur, and they're probably consumed as wild meat as well. So this duality of some things being legal and some things being illegal doesn't really work. It can lead to a lot of laundering, and consumption can continue.
I see. So it's just difficult to regulate. Go ahead, Tim, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say the scale is so crucial. Pangolins have been consumed by a lot of communities in Asia and Africa for centuries and longer than that. The difference and the reason why all pangolin species are threatened with extinction is the scale of trade. And so the fact that demand is so high in China, we've just seen dramatic declines in these populations all over the world. And it's a scale issue. It's just the fact that the demand is so high in China that all populations of pangolins around the world are now experiencing this threat of the trade.
Yeah, and it is important to note that actually China has done a really great job of trying to block the customs and the illegal importing of pangolins and wildlife. The government seems to be, that's why we are seeing, some seizures. That's the discussions that we talked about in the Pangolin Reports podcast was that it is much more difficult to get these pangolins into China now. But I guess it comes back to what Wandermeyer of GlobeScan was also saying, and what you guys are saying is you got to solve the demand. And that is what we talked about in the podcast. But before we wrap up, we wanted to go back to Josie Chan also had a question from Twitter for Tim. And that was that the pangolins that they discovered to have the coronavirus, that Hong Kong U Medicine and Chinese scientists discovered the coronavirus in these pangolins, were actually Malayan pangolins. They actually weren't from China. So does that mean that maybe the coronavirus didn't start in Wuhan? Maybe it started somewhere else?
Yeah, I think there's still an open question about where exactly it began. The fact that these related coronaviruses were in Sunda pangolins, it could still be that there are live traded pangolins into China. They're not, the volume isn't huge as far as I'm aware, but certainly they could have been brought in. It's possible also that it originated outside of China, was brought in that way. I think to really nail down that question, I think a lot more sampling is required of wild pangolins, and also as far as I know, there's only so far been reports of these coronavirus in trafficked pangolins, and so I think that's an interesting question about at what point were these infections, did they originate?
And at the end of the day, if as far as I'm concerned, I think that it doesn't really matter where it came from. It's just, the fact is that keeping wildlife in unhygienic conditions and rampantly, unsustainably exploiting wildlife, going into their habitats, taking them out, keeping them farmed for any purpose, is it for their fur, for their meat, for medicine, is going to result in this sort of thing happening, right? So deciding whether it came from this pangolin population in Malaysia or this one from bats is kind of, I feel, not. It's better to look at the bigger picture and kind of take that from this COVID outbreak, that we need to reflect on how we use natural resources and our relationship with wildlife.
Yeah, even wildlife is a complicated question. So we got an interesting comment from Yifu Wang, which was just adding to the legal side that pangolin scale medicine can only be sold in 711 hospitals right now in China, in mainland China, and only made from the stockpile or legal international import before 2017. And that is, I think, where Astrid mentioned it gets murky. It's difficult to manage that and oversee that in regulations. So it's a challenge, Yifu Wang. I agree with this legal market. It's always difficult to oversee something that's not just black and white. You know, you can do it sometimes, but you can't others. It's easy to avoid things. And then Red Panda, I can't remember your name, Red Panda in Bangkok.
Tony.
He's
from the Wildlife Conservation Society. It's Tony Lynham.
Oh, great, Tony. Thank you. Thank you for joining. So if pangolin scales are considered exclusive or fashionable, then we've also still got a problem. So convincing them not to want to buy them is very important. And that there was a point in the pangolin reports where Jiaming Xu went to Myanmar, and we actually ended the podcast with him saying that he was so disappointed because in Myanmar there were a lot of young people, very well dressed, eating pangolins at restaurants, and that was an ultimate. So I don't know if you guys have a comment on that, on whether is it a fashionable thing then to consume pangolin scales and meat, or?
So I am aware of, there was one example that when we were a former postdoc of mine, Chuang Sing, was studying this. We discovered that there was a piece of jewelry that featured a pangolin scale, and I think it was from a book, if I remember correctly. But it became very fashionable, and there were pretty significant sales of pangolin scales as a consequence of that. So it's true, there are some of these fashionable trends that are somewhat unpredictable. I think at this point the bulk of pangolin demand is still for the traditional Chinese medicine, but yeah, we have to be also aware that there are these other usages, and there are these fashionable trends that can become problematic.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult to figure out who are the main consumers, because for a while as well it was thought to be, corruption that drove pangolin consumption. So like, banquets with officials and things like that. But that's a very difficult target audience to try and get your messaging to, But you have to tailor the messaging, because if it's young, fat people consuming it in Myanmar and then it's corrupt officials consuming it in, I don't know, Vietnam, you need to make your marketing different. You might want to use, I don't know, TikTok for the young people or something, and more traditional approaches for other demographics. So I think it's important to know these kind of trends, but it's difficult to keep up with, right? It's always evolving.
It is. So why don't we, as a wrap-up last question, Laurel Chor just asked us who the leading local individuals or organizations are working on this issue in Hong Kong and China. And maybe we can wrap it up with that, and people can follow up with those organizations too. I
know that in China there is an NGO, it's got a very long acronym. Do you remember the full name, Tim? It's like Conservation, Diversity.
Yeah, it's pretty much, it's the largest animal NGO in China. So it is like our last episode 4, we walked through with Sophia, and it's listed as like National Conservation Biodiversity NGO.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation.
That one.
That pretty much covers it.
So they do a lot of work. Some more effective than others. So I think they're a good place to start in China. And in Hong Kong, there's a few individuals doing research at the Conservation of Forensic Laboratory in HKU. There's a few projects spearheaded by Tim that are being done, trying to figure out where pangolins are coming from and things like that. And yeah, demand reduction. Yeah, Hong Kong for pangolins.
Yeah,
there's WWF Hong Kong, there's Wild Aid, Traffic. There are actually quite a bit of organizations that have been looking at these issues for quite a while. I mean, the pangolin trade issue in my experience. When I first started working on this several years ago, there wasn't a lot of attention on this issue, but certainly in the past 5 years, there's been a concerted effort to work on this because people have been seeing on the ground these big declines in pangolin populations.
Yeah, and even here, it is important to note that HKU Med is doing research on the efficacy of endangered species in Chinese medicine. I think that's like one of the most important things you can do, although it takes at least probably 10 years to get that. Wandermeyer and GlowScan is doing a lot of research with the NGOs on the demand side and how to stop the demand side, which includes things like if you see the posters in the airport, for instance, you know, but trade in pangolins, you will be arrested. That's all behind this market research that GlowScan's doing. So it's easy to get involved, and definitely like the Hong Kong for Pangolins Facebook page, because that's where you'll get most of the updates in Hong Kong. There's also an English site, Sivasathi is giving us on the chat, cbcgdf.org /English. Oh, and that's the China Biodiversity Conservation and Green Development Foundation in the chat. Yeah, they're a great group, and we kind of walked through that a little bit in episode 4, how sensitive pangolins are, how difficult they are to maintain in captivity, which is why there's been such a struggle with the wildlife trafficking, because they die pretty easily in captivity. So, well, are there any wrap-up comments, Tim or Astrid, you'd like to add?
I think there's a lot more to be learned. This subject is changing so rapidly, just in pangolin conservation in general, and certainly with the relationship with coronaviruses. So I think we just need to follow the science, learn from the people who have been working on these issues for a long time in terms of community engagement, governments, and that's going to be our best way forward.
All right.
Yeah, what Tim said.
What Tim said, okay.
But also,
sorry, we'll do one last one. Catherine Chung came in quickly and said, are there any data tools or resources that you would recommend, like #WildEyeAsia for tracking the illegal wildlife? There's got to be a lot of data stuff out there now.
I always check regularly the Hong Kong Customs press release website. So they always release, well, they don't always, but if there is a big seizure of something that is maybe interesting to the media, they will write a press release. So that's a good place to see what's coming through Hong Kong. And it's got, information on volumes. It's sometimes got photos and things. They do a good job with that. And the CITES trade database, even though pangolins have been listed on Appendix 1 of CITES since 2016, there's still trade, for other purposes, and you can look back before that and see what's going on. And that's obviously legal registered trade, but it's still interesting, and it can give indications for what's going on underground.
All right, that's really helpful. I'll also keep an eye on #WildEyeAsia. Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. All right, let's wrap it up. Thank you guys very much for your time. There's definitely more coming. I don't think this is the end of the wildlife trade discussion for a little bit. We're hoping to do another season looking at more what's going on with wildlife trade and asking a lot of questions with the interaction between the coronavirus pandemic and wildlife trade and how that's going to change it. So thanks so much, you guys, for joining us, and we'll see you at the next live stream.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.